This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Get access to my streaming video service Nebula when you sign up for CuriosityStream using the link in the description. We've had 3 sprints now, and fan reaction has been pretty muted, as let's be honest, they haven't added loads to the weekend, have they? Brazil was a lot more fun than the other trials, though this was massively aided by Lewis Hamilton's demotion to the back of the grid and his subsequent overpowered charge through the field to 5th place. And Interlagos is a great track for action and overtaking, so if anywhere was suited for a standout sprint race, Brazil was it. But in general they did end up being quite processional, didn't they? Or if not processional, then not particularly interesting half hour of Formula 1. The UK's inaugural sprint venture saw some shuffling of the order with an average change of position from lights to flag of 2 places per driver. That is, on average, each driver finished 2 places away from their starting position. But obviously Perez had a helping hand in massaging this figure, as not only did he lose 15 positions by spinning out, he also gave everyone below him an extra change in position. So if you pretend Perez stayed where he started, the average position change drops to 1. Meaning Perez's spin bumps the position changes up by 100%. It is also worth noting that a lot of the action and shuffling of the order happened on lap 1, including Hamilton and Verstappen's incredible battle, which they went on to repeat on lap 1 of the actual race, to frustrating results. Now lap 1 also includes Alonso superbly battling his way through the opening lap melee to gain 6 positions, 2 of which he would later lose. Now it's not a bad thing that lap 1 top ends the action. Starts are always the biggest instigator of position changes in adventure, so adding one to the weekend via the sprint is a welcome treat. Just like how it's a bit of a bonus for us viewers when we get a restart after a safety car or a red flag. Now these incredibly basic figures also hide the fact that STINT dropped to 18th after a tussle and then recovered to 11th, which was certainly some decent action from his point of view at least. We have a similar thing in Italy, with an average position change of 1.9 across the sprint, dropping to just 1 again if we discount the effect of Gasly's early accident. Again, a lot of action up front, with Hamilton getting bogged down at the start and the McLarens launching into the key positions that would prove vital for Sunday's race. So the consequences of the sprint here did massively affect the full race, but it wasn't exciting in and of itself, other than that first lap. Brazil was a little different, with a bit more scope for action and overtaking, especially with Hamilton starting from the back in far and away the fastest car. Hamilton gained 15 places all on his own and shuffled the order of everyone he passed along the way, kind of a reverse effect of Perez and Gasly's accidents in previous events. But if we remove the Hamilton effect, the average position drops from 2.3 to 1.4 changes of position per driver, loosely suggesting Hamilton accounted for 64% of position changes. By contrast, the full Brazilian Grand Prix had an average position change of 2.7 places per driver, or 2.3 without the artificiality of Hamilton's grid drop. Now I realise there is an argument here that all these numbers should be halved, because if one car overtakes another, that counts for 1 position change each, but only 1 overall change of position, not 2, but that doesn't really matter here as we're looking at proportionality. Now Hamilton racing from the back was exciting to watch, which opens up a couple of questions. 1. Are reverse grids a good thing? After all, every time the grid mixes the best drivers and cars towards the back, we do get an exciting spectacle. And 2. Did the sprint race unnaturally help Hamilton and Mercedes by giving them an extra third of a race to mitigate the effects of his disqualification? I think the answer to the latter is an inarguable yes. The sprint inserts a session between qualifying and the race that impacts the race. This is something that differs from weekends without a sprint in them, so disqualification or penalties will have different effects. Is this okay? I mean, kind of. All things are basically fair if the rules are the same for everyone, but you have to say they were lucky to be disqualified in Brazil and not, say, Mexico. Though they were unlucky to be disqualified at all, but let's not unsweep that from under the rug. These questions in turn open up further questions, like, should the sprint affect the race at all? This year, qualifying affects the sprint, which affects the race. That is the flow of the weekend. Now in theory, we could disconnect the sprint from the race and have it be or do its own thing. Like if they didn't directly affect the race, then you could have much more leeway to do weird things like reverse grids, which, as discussed, could be a lot of fun. The downside of reverse grids is being super artificial and effectively punishing the drivers for their success, so separating sprints off into their own thing opens possibilities for more variety and structure, but then we ask, what is the point of them? Why would teams care to succeed at them instead of focusing on the rest of the weekend? And this is why it's near impossible to isolate them entirely, and you need to offer championship incentives. You could offer some championship points for them. Maybe the old school 10, 8, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1 for the top 8 or something. Now these are extremely valuable, so we're quickly veering back into territory where reverse grids are undesirable. But we don't have to reverse grids. But then you don't offer much to the lower third of the grid, who will probably drive around for 30 minutes knowing there'll be next to no chance of any points. And if their efforts don't translate forward to the grid, then what's their incentive? So part of me would like to extend the points right down to 20th place, or even 15th at the very least. That way, everybody has something juicy to aim for. But the downside of that is that the sprints become a bit too influential on the championship, as you'd need to give points at about the same scale of the actual Grand Prix at the win level, which isn't the right thing to do. But there is a way to make this work, which I'll get to shortly. Now, another way to add value to the lower end of the grid is an idea offered by Dan Shanice, who suggested the results of the first sprint race form the grid of the next sprint race. This is genuinely a fun idea and kind of chains the sprints into one long mega race, picking up from the last one. This will also mix the grid slightly across the weekends as team strengths change from venue to venue, so the sprint race grid will probably be quite different to the race grid, and any mistakes like Perez's spin will carry through to the next sprint race. But either way, giving proper points for sprint results gives drivers a real incentive to do well, much more than the measly 3, 2, 1 points offered in the trials. And if it comes with the added knowledge that their results won't affect the Grand Prix starting position, they can really take risks without worrying about Sunday. An alternative to offering championship points for every sprint is an idea with increasing impetus behind it. A sprint championship. The idea is that sprint races form their own championship, separate from the main World Championship. While the main World Championship gathers points from the Grand Prix, the Sprint Championship gathers points from the sprints. Okay, well, what's the point of the Sprint Championship then, other than some minor glory that falls well below the main standings? Well, the mooted idea is that once all the sprint races are run and the Sprint Championship decided, the top 10 drivers from the Sprint Championship will then get actual World Championship points added to their main championship total based on where they finished overall in the sprints. So each sprint race does count for something and is important and worth fighting for, but it doesn't interrupt the normal qualifying to race structure of the weekend. This could be a cool idea, maybe a little harder to keep track of. You'd have to keep in mind as the season progresses that there are these potential points hanging over the championship that will suddenly get injected one weekend. And you have to make sure each sprint season ends well before the actual season ends, so we don't suddenly decide the championship with it. Not that I think that's very likely. There will only be a couple of points between the top two, which actually isn't very influential. But then, how important a factor do we want the sprints to be? That's a huge question with no clear answer. It seems people, and Formula One, don't want them messing with the championship too much. But if they have no stakes, then they lose all purpose. Okay, so let's go back a step. How do we set up the grid for the sprint if we don't use the sprint to set up the grid for the race? I think the majority consensus is that qualifying should set the grid for the race, and that pole position should be attributed to the winner of qualifying, all penalties aside, and that it's best to keep sprints out of this process. So I've had a couple of ideas. The first is that the grid is set by your second best lap time in each of the qualifying sessions. So Q1 sets positions 16 to 20, Q2 sets positions 11 to 15, and Q3 sets the top 10 as normal. But within each session, your best time sets the Grand Prix grid, and your second best time sets the sprint grid. This adds more jeopardy and intrigue to every qualifying session, as every lap is important, and sighter laps or banker laps will make way for proper go-for-it laps whenever you leave the garage, because you can't muck around anymore. This will be especially important if these sprints bear actual championship points, as you'll really want to maximise every run and not throw away a potentially good position in that sprint race. When qualifying takes place in changeable conditions like a drying track, we would normally have to wait around as drivers leave their hot runs to the driest, most optimal moment. Less so with this. They're gonna have to get out there when it's wet and do their best, or they just won't get 2 laps in. An alternative to this is just to set the entire sprint grid from everyone's Q1 times. It's a slightly simpler system than what I just mentioned and probably a little easier to follow. And one could argue that Q2 and Q3 are plenty exciting on their own without adding second best times to the mix. Q1 on the other hand is a session that could do with a little sprucing up as the top half of the field do the bare minimum to move on to Q2 and the eliminated drivers are often quite predictable. But if lap times really matter in Q1, then we could see all 20 drivers going for maximum attack all session. Either way, while both of these ideas give some added excitement to qualifying, they really don't make the sprints themselves much better, which was the whole point. Other than dangling actual championship points in front of the drivers, what else can be done here? Well, firstly, everything I say comes with the caveat that we have no idea how the 2022 cars will affect the racing. They might solve a lot of the issues with processions all by themselves. Who can say at this point? But here's the thing about F1. It's not designed for sprints. Everyone says they want flat-out racing from lights to flag, but I don't think they do in practice. And it's certainly not what F1 is good at. If everyone can go flat-out constantly, the fast cars will just drive away from the slower ones. F1 succeeds because of strategy, for the most part. The Grand Prix is a long race. Not an endurance or anything, but a good 90 to 100 minutes of racing on average, over 300 kilometers. The way cars battle and interact in meaningful ways is brought forth like it is in any good strategy game, by giving teams and drivers a number of decisions to make that come with pros and cons. The soft tyre is the fastest at this track, but will burn through it quickly and be left vulnerable later on. Pushing flat out right now will open up a useful gap, but will force us to pace ourselves and use less fuel later on. Taking this set of tyres longer will give us the best overall race pace, but taking the undercut now will give us the best chance at track position. Taking an engine penalty will lose us 10 places on the grid, but will give us a stronger pool of power units for the remaining Grand Prix. In a sport where cars have multiple competing strengths and weaknesses, forcing drivers to balance performance by sacrificing pace and position at some points of the race for the chance to gain it back and more at other points encourages racing and competition across the Grand Prix far more than flat-out racing can. The sprint takes a lot of that away because the sprint is basically just the first stint of a full race in replica. The first stint of a Grand Prix, all things being normal, is often the least exciting bit. It's when people on Twitter get impatient and prematurely start reaching for that white ninja meme. That's because the first stint, after the opening lap or two of action, is about pacing yourself for the stops. You're setting yourself up for the rest of the race at this point, and you don't want to burn out your tyres or push too hard if you don't think you can actually make up positions easily at this stage. You know there is far greater opportunity for overtaking through the pit stop phase, via undercuts and overcuts, or by varying your strategy against those around you through the second and third stint. You could go longer in order to use fresher tyres or a softer compound than your rival later on, sacrificing some time up front to be racy in the back half of the race. You could go for a more conservative approach, taking longer stints on harder tyres, knowing you may have to defend on old tyres later on. The phase of the race after the first stint is where it starts to come alive. Sprints don't have this. There is no later phase of the race or second stint, so everybody is on the same age of tyre from the beginning. So there's almost no strategic element other than the choice of tyre compound. Bottas got the jump on Verstappen in Brazil by using soft tyres, and for a while there was a little suspense over whether he'd be able to hold the lead once the softs ran out of life compared to Max's mediums, but he did manage it, and quite easily. So that was that. So what can be done other than reversing the grid? Well, Pirelli could bring a sprint compound at the very least. Something that can be pushed hard without risk, well over 100 kilometers with no degradation. The race Pirellis are designed to degrade for the very purpose of strategy, but if there's no strategy like this in the sprint, use tyres that can be attacked. Otherwise, if you wanted to inject a strategic element, it comes down to things like mandating that every driver take a trip down the pit lane at least once, like a joker lap. This does kind of defeat the point of the sprint, but might make for some intriguing choices. Or we could do things like play about with limiting when drivers can use their maximum electric power output, something that could be easily programmed into the ECU. This is ripped straight from Formula E's playbook, but it's something that can work well without being overpowering. There are no easy answers here. I think the main problem is the sprint concept as a whole doesn't really add anything yet, other than making for a more dynamic weekend structure, which has been a good thing, don't get me wrong. So I think the best we can do at the moment is this. Make sprint races count for actual decent championship points to incentivize drivers to do as well as they can. Detach the sprints from Sunday's race grid so the drivers can take risks without worrying about the Grand Prix. Connect the sprint grids to qualifying, but take Q1 times or drivers' second best times in order to take the opportunity to liven up qualifying and slightly mix the Saturday and Sunday grids from each other. Maybe give them a strategic tool to play with, if possible. Give them a tyre they can push hard on for the entire race. And pick your choice of tracks wisely so they do actually have the opportunity to race each other at this shorter length. Obviously don't do them at Monaco or Hungary. But what do you think? Assuming that we have to have sprints, how would you like to see them implemented? Let me know. And if you enjoyed this video and others on this channel, then you'll really love the indulgence of content over on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming platform where I and other creators made a place to showcase our content ad-free and thus without having to worry about any of YouTube's peculiarities with algorithms and monetization and such. You'll find lots of interesting, in-depth education or education-adjacent videos on a whole variety of topics like music, gaming, film, history, or those things kicking off in the zeitgeist that you want to know more about. Like, what is this metaverse thing that everyone's going on about? Well, resident technology expert Jordan Howard has your back, right here. And Nebula has stuff you just won't find on YouTube at all. If you see this little plus icon, the video contains exclusive content. And there are even entire Nebula original series like Story Mode, which delves into the narratives of games. And Nebula has partnered with CuriosityStream to give you an amazing bundle. CuriosityStream is a premium educational and documentary streaming platform with thousands of incredible films, like Ticket to the Future on the evolution of travel. Something I think we're all very aware of with the continued conversation between racetrack technology and broader transport solutions. Because CuriosityStream love the independent, creative, educational energy of Nebula so much, they've teamed up to give a very cool deal. If you sign up to CuriosityStream, you will get access to Nebula completely free for as long as you're a CuriosityStream subscriber. And if you sign up via my link in the description, curiositystream.com/chamber, you will get 26% off the annual plan, which is just $14.79 for the whole year. For both platforms, together. As soon as you sign up with my code, Nebula sends you a welcome email. You'll be getting a lot of brilliant content for an amazing price. And you'll be supporting me and my fellow creators at the same time. Enjoy it!